the devil hum a gospel tune beneath the weight of a blood red moon, just as sleeps in southern dove, but bones remember what lies can't hurt.
Welcome to Make It Make Sense, Alabama. If it affects people's rights, safety, or ability to advocate for themselves in Alabama, we believe that it deserves an explanation. That is exactly what this podcast is here to do. I'm Whitney Scapecchi. I'm here today with my partner, Neeli Faulkner. We're focused on accountability, justice, and vivid understanding across the state. Each episode breaks down complex issues in plain language using public records, personal interviews, and verified information. Today, we are discussing a bill that is currently moving through the Alabama Legislature, HB7, which changes Alabama's law on what qualifies as a terrorist threat. It expands the legal definitions on what counts as a credible threat. It also increases penalties, including raising first-degree terrorist threat from a Class C felony to a Class B felony. It also requires school principals to immediately notify law enforcement if a student's consent could qualify as a terrorist threat. It requires restitution if someone is convicted, including repayment for emergency response cost, capped at $10,000. This bill has already passed the House. We're also going to be talking about SB31, which is almost identical to HB7 in language, as well as the idea. SB31 has not yet passed through.
And with us today to help break down some of the negative effects of HB7 and SB31 is James Gallini. Gallini is a special education and civil rights attorney and the founder of the Gallini Group. His practice focuses on representing students and families in matters involving disability rights, school discipline, and constitutional issues. Over the course of his career, he has worked with lawmakers, education agencies, and policy groups on proposed legislation and education policy, while also advocating directly for families navigating disputes within public schools and the juvenile system. Licensed in multiple states and admitted before the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, he has argued appellate cases and serves as a national trainer for parents and educators on special education law. His work is also informed by his experience as a father of a child with special needs, which has shaped his perspective on balancing strong advocacy while maintaining working relationships inside public school systems. Gallini argues HB7 and SB31 could expand subjective interpretations of student speech and that the bill's automatic one-year school ban triggered by a criminal charge could hit students with disabilities hardest. He says existing special education safeguards do not undo arrest, stigma, or the practical damage that happens before a case is resolved. So thank you, James, for joining us. We're very excited to have you here and to talk about HB7 and SB31.
Well, thank you for having me.
I mean, I know we kind of went over an overview of what it was, but in your words, talk to us about these bills and just tell us how they came across your radar.
Well, quite accidental because by the time SB7 or HB7, came across my radar, and that was, I don't even know who it was that let me know about it, but it had already been passed by the House. At that point, we had to turn our focus to the Senate companion bill that's almost identical, if not identical, which is SB31. That one has not yet been voted on. And you know, as far as last week, and I was in New Mexico all last week, it was my understanding that they put a pause on it, and so it hasn't gotten out of committee yet. That's James Woods is the sponsor of the bill on the Senate side. And so he has, he did leave a message, but I was in mediation last week when he tried to call me because I think there is groups and individuals that have reached out to him directly. We didn't have that opportunity with Lomax. Did I just call him James Wood? I think that James Lomax. Is it also James Wood?
I think that's an actor.
No, I know James Woods is an actor, but I just want to make sure. Am I correct as to?
Yeah. Are you talking about on SB31?
Yes.
Yes.
Senator
okay. So it's
Woods.
Senators Woods and Kitchens.
Yes. Okay. Well, I'll just go with that. Okay. So just excuse me, anybody out there, if he's like, you know, because I don't want him to be like, that's not my name. I'm not James Wood. Okay. But this is where on that side, this is sort of where we have the opportunity to make some sense of it and try to, in my viewpoint, get it quashed, because I don't see how it's redeemable. And the other thing is, I'm not seeing the emergency circumstance for why our existing terrorist threat statute needs changing. There is no data points out there because obviously we're dealing with juveniles. So there's not going to be data points, and especially comparative to adults, as to where the bulk of our terrorist threat charges go. Now, obviously, from my perspective, as an attorney that cross-represents in juvenile criminal court solely when it impacts a kid that has an IEP or a 504 plan, which is a disability-related plans. At that point, yes, we will cross-represent in juvenile court. Most of the time, because what we're doing, and a lot of the public do not understand that, we're double dosing the punishment. If they're being charged in juvenile court, they're also being charged internally by the school under their student code of conduct. Now, a lot of the student code of conduct cross-utilizes the juvenile criminal statute. So, for example, every school system within their student code of conduct has an existing terrorist threat student code of conduct point. Okay, so it mirrors in an identifiable degree with what the existing Alabama statute says. The difference is that the current one, not these bills being tossed around that want to change it, but the existing one has been such a damaging thing when it comes to any student, and especially students that have been identified with special needs or disability, just simply because so much of it is up for perception. And children in public schools have a diminished right as it is to due process of law. It's not the same criminal standard, especially within our public schools. It's just not the same. I mean, they can, because of in loco parentis, if you enroll your child in a public school, they can search your locker, they can search your vehicle. They don't have to call the parent and include them per se, because you have registered and enrolled your child. And so during the course of the school day, in loco parentis means that the school acts as parent. So therefore, they are the arbiters at that point, or the safeguard for some of your children's rights. Though you still maintain some as a parent, some of it is shared by the public institution that you've chosen to enroll your child into. So at that point, we consider those due process rights diminished, though they're still there. The problem is that the Alabama Legislature had to strengthen the due process statute that applies to public education that went into effect in August of 24. And because of some rampant abuse, and that was brought to light through, let's say, Southern Poverty Law Center, ADAP, other organizations that does the same kind of, let's say, child advocacy. The legislature had to change some of those rules that went into effect. The problem with these bills is it really hits and conflicts with the due process rules because there's some automatic, like 1-year suspensions just for accusing a kid. That's all that it requires. If you look at the bill, the interpretation of the bill, that's what we're running into, is that, and also watering down what a credible threat is in an environment where, I guess in our post-truth world, or I guess what people in our society, and I guess as an attorney, I'm just trying to be careful in my wording. I rely upon language. I mean, we have our own dictionary, Black's Law Dictionary, and whether people like it or not, whether it's offensive or not, it's not politically correct. It is what it is, because lawyers, in order for us to apply legislation, constitutional rights, criminal codes, civil codes, we need to absolutely understand what the definitions of things are. To change our existing terrorist statute under credible threat by having it be something communicated in writing, electronically, verbally, and then by any other means to an individual, or let's say a group of people, but the individual is the big one. Then at that point, you go down the next list, and like the third point would be that this person reasonably perceived that the intent was there, and then perceived that let's say the child, had the intent and the means to carry it out. Well, what does that even mean? And so if we're judging it based upon somebody else's reasonable perception that a kindergartner going like this in a classroom, because I can't tell you how many kids that I have to represent in kindergarten that are going around doing this to the teacher, and the child is removed and written up for it. And I've had kids in the past be written up as a terrorist threat under that. Now, did it go into the juvenile? No, it didn't go into the juvenile court. Not for that per se, but it removed the child from their learning environment. But what we're getting into is now the kindergarten teacher is saying, well, I reasonably perceived that Timmy, by doing this, had the intent and potentially the means, because maybe the parents have a gun at home that they don't, put up and lock up. That's all that's required. That's all that's required under this. At the same time, and I did a video about this. One of the ones that still haunts me is it took me 3 weeks to get this 14-year-old out of juvenile detention. And well, I'm not gonna say the name of the county. We'll just call it Melby County, in Alabama. We'll just call it that. Melby County in Alabama. And 3 weeks it took me to get this young boy out. High functioning autism. They thought he was weird, odd, as they all do. A lot of kids, as far as their perception, a lot of the teachers, the adults, because they simply don't understand autism. Not only that, is there's been this stigma that, quite frankly, is absolutely unwarranted, to where everybody makes these jokes that there's school shooters or potential school shooters, when if you go and look, there hasn't been one that anybody can point to and say this was an autistic kid. That is not historically true or factual on any level. But yet that's sort of the stigma that we hear. Oh, these autistics are out there doing this mayhem and chaos. Because I had to represent one against the feds, because the FBI came down on this kid, had him arrested, set him up, groomed him for 6 months on the internet, because they have their facility out of Oklahoma City where they crawl the internet, finding vulnerable kids like this. And the justification that they have for doing it is, if we don't do it, ISIS will do it. If we don't groom these kids, then ISIS will find them. So we want to find them before somebody else does, and we want to groom them and turn them into these radical Islamists. And this kid didn't have any friends. He thought that these guys that friended him organically on the internet were friends of his, and when in reality they were FBI agents. And how did they even find him? He was in a specialized day program in Alabama, publicly funded, to where he made a purchase at Walmart of a book about Osama bin Laden. That was part of their exercise, to teach them how to make purchases. And because he made this purchase of an Osama bin Laden book at Walmart, the instructors, because remember, we have see something, say something. And, it's not our job to use common sense. So they called the FBI agents in, I think, Gadsden, and reported this. He bought an Osama bin Laden book. What ended up happening is that they got Oklahoma City involved. They searched him out on the internet, and hence it took me a year to get this kid out of jail. They charged him as an adult for a terrorist threat. All because within his public education program, where they were teaching him how to make purchases, and he could not formulate intent. His developmental disability was to that degree to where he could not formulate intent, nor did he have any kind of means to carry it out. It did not mean that this statute was used by our government, groomed by our government. He had no contact with anybody, even remotely, from the Middle East. It was from top to bottom created by our government using this exact statute, not the current one, not the future one, not the one they're debating currently. And like I said, that's how we ended up getting him out, is that finally the psychological reports came back that he had such diminished capacity that he could not formulate the intent, nor did he have a means to carry it out. That's called mens rea, and that's the other thing that's missing from all of this, is that we no longer we have mens rea and we have actus rea. Those are both missing now. We don't have to do that. It just has to be somebody's reasonable perception that I thought Timmy was making a threat. I thought Timmy, he caused me to fear. That's all. But that's all it takes. But that 14-year-old, it was done by one girl that thought she heard him talking to himself on the track, and then invented this thing that, I heard him saying names like not Sansa Stark. What's the one that was always making the list, her kill list?
Arya.
Yeah. that like Arya Stark, he was out there just repeating names and it was a kill list, all fabricated, but it made her popular, her friend group. Then they were texting their parents. Everybody in the community went down there to pull their children out. Even though the principal had pulled this boy in, this boy denied, I didn't say anything. But because of the public outrage and the public outcry that something had to be done, they arrested and charged the kid, the SRO, with absolutely no proof other than this girl saying that she heard him make this threat. We ended up finding out that was absolutely concocted, made up. So by definition, under our current terrorist threat law, she should have been arrested because she's the one that brought fear into the community. She's the one that caused the disruption in the school day, not him. But she wasn't charged. She was permitted to move to a different school in order to safeguard her reputation, when it all came out that it was all made up. But it took me 3 weeks to get him out of jail. At the end of that 3 weeks, when he went in front of the judge, that's when the judge giving the whole rundown of, do you understand what the charges are? And being nice, I'm not saying anything negative about the judge, but the boy with trembling voice and crying said, am I going to get the death penalty for this? And it shocked all of us, including the judge. And the judge looked at me and I told him, I said, this is autism. And then the judge tried to lighten it up and asked him what he learned over the 3 weeks in jail. And he says, well, I learned bad words. I learned all about drugs. This is how innocent he was. All it took was one girl with her perception of what she thought she heard, reported to other girls, which, not being negative about girls, but this is where I'm seeing a lot of this stuff. I'm seeing a lot of it formulated as a new form of bullying because these kids have become very, very savvy about technology. They have. And a lot of the accusations I'm now running into at schools are these accusations made by groups of girls, and to where these boys are guilty before anybody ever considers them innocent, before there's any kind of legitimate investigation as to whether, and especially if these boys are slightly odd, and the girls are to be believed. It does not matter. They are to be believed. And
I think across the board, our children nowadays, they don't understand that there are repercussions to your actions. I have a child who is 12 years old. She'll be 13 soon. And I see it with her friends. And they don't understand that you can't just make claims against someone, because now we have adults out here that are criminalizing behavior that when we were kids, it wasn't criminalized, but we learned from it. And so we just quickly jump to somebody, well, if a law enforcement gets involved, then, at least I'll be able to still go to school. And especially against children with disabilities, because so often you're absolutely right, people don't understand that autism is a spectrum. So when you think of a child that is autistic, sometimes they think, it's somebody that just cannot function within a classroom, but that's not true. We actually see many students with not just autism, but ADHD. We may see somebody with like Tourette's, things that aren't properly understood. I have a child with a disability, and even I don't understand fully that. You probably more so than anyone here on this call, because you deal with it all the time. But even teachers out there not understanding this. But I guess where I'm getting with this, my question is, what is happening within our school system that our legislators felt the need to introduce this bill, not just once, but really twice? Why did we feel the need to introduce duplicate bills? What data are we using to determine that there is a need for this, to increase these penalties and to be so drastic?
Well, this is where I can't get an answer from the sponsors as to who really confronted them, who approached them and said, we absolutely need this. There's an exigent circumstance. There's an emergency that is happening in Alabama, and here's the data. What I heard is that for some reason, some of these legislators and state senators have been told that the reason we're hemorrhaging students to homeschool or micro schools or charter schools is because of this safety issue in front of, inside the schools, to where kids are afraid to go to school. And that's what a lot of these senators or legislators have cited as the purpose behind this change. I think that that's absolutely naive, and they need to spend more time in the actual schools in order for them to understand that that's not the case. We have problems. Absolutely, we have problems. And I'm going to answer your question specific to what I think is really behind this. At the same time, this is what I'm hearing. Who is behind it? At the same time, there isn't going to be any kind of data set because of privacy rights within FERPA, which is the no teeth equivalent to HIPAA for public education, to where students have privacy with regards to their education records. At the same time, within our juvenile justice system, there's also privacy there. So this stuff isn't going to be readily available as to helping our senators and legislators understand the disparity as to who's being charged, and especially the internal data within the schools as to how they have been abusing the heck out of our current terroristic threat statute that all the schools adopted as part of their student code of conduct. It just isn't that difficult to stick a kid with a terrorist threat in order to justify removing them from an education environment strictly based upon a kindergartner doing this with his fingers. Okay. Now, I didn't have that growing up because I'm a lot older than you two, I think. I went to elementary school in the 70s and middle school and high school in the 80s, so we didn't have all that stuff. And it didn't mean that we didn't fight. It didn't mean that we didn't make these threats to each other. I mean, we all did all the time. I'm going to kill you. We said it. But at the same time, of course, people go, well, we live in a different day and age. Do we? I don't think we do. I think the institutions have changed. I don't think humans have changed. I think the institutions have changed to the point where, because, and I'm going to say that 1994 crime bill was the biggest catalyst change in our society when it came to how we discipline children inside of our schools. And as a result, we have created a school to prison pipeline as a result. That's where zero tolerance came in, because under the 1994 crime bill, that, by the way, was championed by Biden as senator. And then what's strangely ironic is that during the Obama administration, Arne Duncan, the education secretary, along with the Department of Justice at the time, tried to make it a focus to get the schools to back off of zero tolerance because of how damaging it is. We have the statistics of how damaging it is, and how certain racial groups and special needs groups are over identified and over punished as a result of zero tolerance. Okay, we know that. The statistics are there. Did any school under Arne Duncan and the Department of Justice from Obama back off of zero tolerance? No, not at all. But people don't understand that the reason that the schools adopted zero tolerance in the beginning was that it came with grant money. So in 1994, it came with grant money. So we paid our schools off to overhaul their student code of conduct, to become extremely heavy-handed, to where the fist and the face get the same exact punishment. There is no righteous judge anymore, which was the role of our principals. Our principals could sit there and say, what was this about? So that we had the teachable moment for our kids. Our entire education system used to be set up as a nice little environment, a petri dish, so to speak, to help raise our kids in a civil society, to where we didn't criminalize childhood. We understood that they were emotionally dysregulated. They could not think like adults. But now we've inserted the requirements of adulthood with children incapable of adulthood. Their brains are in rapid development until 26. They can't control their emotion, their speech, to the degree that adults can. And not only that, as a lot of our teachers are horrible examples of the same. So therefore, they're hypocrites. And not only that, they're tyrants and despots in how they apply this stuff, to where our kids see that. They see the hypocrisy. And whereas it used to be this relationship and this collaboration within our communities between parents and the education system, that's been removed because zero tolerance, and also the lack of transparency by the schools with regards to their relationship with the community that pays their salaries, because they've locked up their schools. The transparency is not there anymore, especially post-COVID. You cannot enter there. And of course, they use the excuse of safety to do it. That's their new thing. The parents can't come in because we are automatically, we're under suspicion. Mm-hmm. So we can't come into our schools freely like we once did. But you have that combination along with the hypocrisy of application of the zero tolerance, to the point where Parents are now in a very uncomfortable position of choosing between partnering with the school system or maintaining that relationship with our children, of riding that line and saying, I don't condone what you did, child. At the same time, the proposed punishment goes too far. And at that point, now you have this perception that's been going on for generations now, since 1994, of an us against them situation within our own communities, to where the teachers and the administrators think that the parents are against them, which, of course, during the Biden administration, we had Merrick Garland that was actually going out there. We know now through his notes or proposals that he sent out to the various departments of justice, to where they were attempting to criminalize parents at board meetings for their free speech and trying to advocate changes within their own boards of education. You have all of that to where the terrorist threat came about after 9/11. And of course, the terrorist threat wasn't a thing before then. We have plenty of criminal codes on our books currently to address that very issue. Why do we need more? And people sit there and go, well, hate crimes. Every crime is a hate crime if you really think about it. Why isn't our existing laws good enough? Why is it that we have to continue to criminalize everybody and everything for any reason? And that's really what this is about. You sit there and you go, well, why is that? Well, because terrorist threat, in 2001, when it all went about, we got hoodwinked to think, oh, it's about foreign Islamists that came into our country and, tried to hurt us. No, this is all domestic. All of it. It's all domestic. We're not going after foreign-born anybody. Regardless of what people may be out blocking streets about ICE and whatever, this has nothing to do with that. This is completely solely within our schools, is how they're applying it, is whatever little Timmy says or whatever little Timmy does that somebody perceived in a certain way. So what you end up having in a lot of the situations that I run into, probably the overwhelming majority, is not only is it vulnerable populations, but it's also the families in those communities that, number one, can't afford this restitution. So they're constantly going to be on the hook to government, probably DHR's involved and every other state agency calling them bad parents who don't have names in the community that can be targeted by these small rural counties whose judges know the superintendents. And people don't understand that in Alabama, who's the largest employer in most of the counties in the state?
The school system.
The school systems. So and that answers your question. So who's really behind this? We have a problem in Alabama right now. We have closed multiple day programs that used to be available to send kids that had, let's say, behaviors that reached a point to where the school system could not service them appropriately within the school setting. Okay. And my daughter, she has classic autism. She's always required a self-contained special education environment. General education was never appropriate for her. So we never put her in that environment. It would have been disruptive to the other kids and their right to an education. At the same time, I'm seeing an increase in my clients that I represent of reports of having to clear classrooms because of meltdowns and things of that nature, which is absolutely inappropriate. I don't condone that. At the same time, did the school follow the rules? Because it just does not take that long to identify whether that's an appropriate environment for the child. And really, the secondary reason that we take those steps is so that we're making sure that the child is not being discriminated against because the adults are triggering the child on purpose to get them out of the environment. It's not that the child, under the right conditions and with the right plan, can't be successful in the environment, but we need to take the step to verify that the adult isn't the trigger and the reason, because he or she may have a sinister purpose for not having Timmy in the classroom. But at the same time, it just doesn't take that long to follow those steps, to have the necessary data collection to support that this is not the right environment for the child. Now, we have that meltdown, we have the class clearing, we have holes in walls, we have keyboards thrown, computers thrown. It happens all the time. So what used to be available over the years, mental health in Alabama has trashed our entire mental health, and along with our legislature, by the way, to where we've closed our mental health institutions. Okay, so that meant that all the people that were in the institutions now have Medicaid waivers, which means that the existing beds that are out there are being taken by individuals, adult individuals that had places at our institutions. So now we've flooded the Medicaid waiver system. We have day programs, long-term and short-term residential stays, but we've closed a couple of those that used to be accessible for our schools. We don't have enough of these places in private or public. And so what ends up happening is now these schools are left without these solutions. And I was talking to a couple superintendents through their board attorneys about proposing legislation this session to create a region system similar to what they have in New Mexico and Texas, to where the State Department of Education through the legislature funds regions, to where we have a singular location that the surrounding school systems, city or county school systems, can send a child that has that level of complex needs, because it can't be served appropriately inside their school, because we don't have those. We don't have
James, you cut out just a little bit. I just wanted, like, you've been crystal clear the whole time, but just then it broke. But you said that you had worked with some school board attorneys to create a regional what for these students with needs?
Well, it'd have to be legislation.
Yes.
And so there's a few model bills out there. I just didn't have the time to do it in December. I regret it now, because this is their solution. Instead of doing it through the region system and having the Department of Education mandated to create regions, what like New Mexico has regions, and so a lot of the states have regions, to where they'll pull those resources for those city or county schools that are in close proximity to one another, to where they have a standalone facility that has occupational therapists, mental health counselors, social workers, speech language pathologists, ABA, special education teachers, to where it is a fine-tuned placement option for these complex kids that these superintendents and these boards of education don't know what to do with, because they're having to clear classrooms, and they're having to, now parents in the area are upset because they're going, well, my daughter can't get an education because, little Johnny's, you guys are clearing the classroom every other week. Well, every other week? Okay.
So that was where my issue started with the school system. I've
Sure.
been public about that. I don't know if you ever followed my story with my son. So what you're talking about, these regional, systems where we have okay. Well, that's my question for you is, like, I was on the side of, there was a child that was attacking my son repeatedly, that their needs were not being met, right? Both sides were being failed here. And I am, a huge advocate for mental health, but I have a real problem, especially in Alabama, whenever we shift, mental health is now like, it's just private business, right? And once we shift to those kids over there, it's so complex. I will just say this. So with All to Point, and I'm seeing it again, like NAFCARE is one of them. I've researched it across the state. I got a hold of one of the internal forms and I sent it to the Board of Education because they want to open this All to Point mental health day school. And I'm actively trying to fight it, because once we shift these kids over and they're in these private facilities and there's no oversight, that's one issue that we have. I talk to many families. I do investigative journalism, horror stories of families that listened to the school system before this mental health day model existed. They're like, your child's exhibiting these behaviors. They send them over there. And then turns out 2 years later, the child is not better. And the entire time it's been an intellectual disability. That was the root of it. But now this child has 3 different mental health diagnoses and still not thriving in school. That's an issue. My other issue is that while investigating All to Point in this mental health day school, I obtained an internal referral form for All to Point. And so public facing everything, because there's already one in Mobile, but public facing, all of the documentation points to the fact that, it's all compliant, right? With federal education law, child fine, IDA. But I got a hold of the internal referral form, and there's the gen ed student box, right? Where they can just bypass everything as long as a child exhibits, I think it was 5 of the 22 behaviors listed on the sheet. And I guess that's my concern, is like, I agree with you. There should be a location where these children can go. They can be in the least restrictive environment, not disrupt the other classes. But like, what do we do when All to Point is the option, right? Like, and I feel comfortable saying that.
Well, and they're not the only ones. I mean, but this is the problem. I mean, just like it's like the private prison systems that they need customers. And so how do you get customers? And so, you reoffend. And that's my problem with the mental health model that Alabama currently has, these regions are public, okay? Like Michigan. We can take cases in Michigan as well. Michigan forbids public monies for education to be spent with third-party mental health facilities or third-party clinics, okay? So that forces the education system to solve their own problem. So they have regions, but the regions there are highly structured. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but I'm saying that out of all the models, Michigan is sitting there saying, look, these are public funds. We need to make it, we need to meet our responsibility and accountability, because with Altapoint and with everybody else, well, they got to shave some off for themselves. You know, they've got investors and they've got to meet, you know, their profit margin. But in Michigan, in along with the regions in the states that I mentioned, but there, even in the most rural area in the outskirts of Michigan, because we had a case there, the special education environment that was functioning like a day program was overseen by an independent school district that served all the special education, that the day programs. So basically, they had their own administrators, their own trained staff that were highly qualified, and they would come in and work collaboratively with the school system's IEP team. And what would end up happening is, instead of building a standalone facility, they would find the little area, they'd find a school where they could basically rent or use space within that existing school. That was part of the day program. So it worked independent of the school in which it was housed. So it was a cost saver on that front, but then it was able to serve the rural areas in that region to be able to provide services to these very complex kids. But then worked within that school to where as they were being successful with the students, now we had a public environment to where they could start being integrated into the general education before they went back to their home schools, to make sure that it was being successful. Why we can't do that in Alabama is beyond me, but this is where we were starting to go. I just did not have the time. I regret it, because there's plenty of model bills out there, and I didn't realize that the snakes were in the grass wanting to push this through as their alternative solution, because where they're making the changes is automatic 1-year suspensions. And it doesn't matter, adjudicated, and the clever word is adjudicated or convicted. Adjudicated or convicted, really? Because 99.99% of these never, ever, ever go to trial because it's juvenile court. It's a completely different legal standard. Alabama is a rehabilitative state. We do not punish our juveniles. So the entire focus is rehabilitation. So it's not a beyond a reasonable doubt standard. It's not the same as adult criminal court, and people don't understand that. And so when you go in there, you're supposed to go in there and go, okay, what does this kid need in order for them to get better, the rehabilitation standard? At the same time, Alabama also has something called the Multi-Needs Committee as another safety net layer within each county. Well, who sits on the Multi-Needs Committee? Well, the
I can
court,
tell you. Yeah.
juvenile probation office, mental health, DHR, and the school system. Now, you're sitting there going, why would the school system be a member of multi-needs? Because they don't like to tell people they get federal and state money, a lot of it. So they actually, for these kids that are in multi-needs, most of them have IEPs or Section 504 plans, or should have them. So therefore, this is where the resources are in most of our places. But the schools don't want to spend it on these kids. They would rather have mental health. They would rather have DHR. They would rather have the court system pull out of their resources and get this kid out of their system. But because they're the largest employer in a lot of these counties and cities, they carry a lot of political weight. And so they get rid of these kids. And this is another mechanism to do it. I've got a case, we'll just call it Latauga County, just making these places up. To where I am representing a kid currently that they railroaded that kid, and instead of expelling him, okay, because expelling him would have triggered that expulsion due process new law that Alabama put into place in August of 24. No, they didn't do that. It was a mandatory 1-year virtual platform. That is the new clever way. 1-year virtual platform. Now, Is it constitutional? Is it legal? Well, somebody's going to have to challenge it. And it looks like that guy's going to be me. Because if the IEP team and if the team that serves that child cannot move the child along that continuum, that least restrictive environment continuum, then I'm sorry, that kid's expelled. That kid's long-term suspended. And you can't do that. So this is where they're doing these things regardless of what the federal and state law says. The schools are already doing it. And they're already applying their own disciplinary standard because they are saying that this is why they can't keep teachers. Doesn't have anything to do with the low amount of pay that they're paying them.
Right.
Possibly be that. You know, along with, we are extremely top heavy with regards to administration. You can look any school in the state of Alabama, the amount of money we're spending on administration is insane compared to what we're paying on our teacher units. But nobody's making a big deal about that. How many principals did you guys have at your schools growing up?
Maybe 2, maybe.
Okay, that's just not the case anymore. And you're
No.
talking about people making between, you know, let's say $80,000 and $115,000. That how many teacher units, how many aides could that pay for?
But and talk about, you know, assistant superintendents. Like, I mean, I've honestly lost count.
And that's
Hey, well,
where
our superintendent makes $275,000 a year. We have 2 schools in our system and around 1,300 students, but we pay our superintendent almost $300,000. That's crazy.
Well, that's not it. You know, like I said, I know that I was around when he was negotiating his sweetheart deal up north, which included, you know, moving expenses, mileage reimbursement. I think that car usage. That salary does not include all the other perks.
Oh, I know.
But that's the other problem.
God bless.
That's the other problem in our system is that now these school boards are using headhunter groups to go out and negotiate as though these men and women are NFL players and are worth, you know, this kind of attention and money when in reality it's
unreal.
It is. We can't have nice things because we're extremely administratively top heavy. At the end of the day, people don't want to spend the money on these children because it's not a football field, it's not sports facilities, but they want to complain about these kids. They want to complain about, that's kids with disabilities. I'm not even including the majority of our problem in our schools are the kids that come from bad environments because there is no law that, see, it's easy to remove my clients because there's a mechanism and a plan in place through the law to where if you just follow it, you can remove them. Okay? Yeah. You can. But with kids that come from bad environmental backgrounds, other than within, let's say, Title II or Title I of Every Student Succeeds Act, which nobody follows and nobody knows about, there's some mechanisms in there, and there was supposedly some funding to help in those areas, but it's also politically incorrect, frankly, to target kids that come from bad environments. And none of these principals want to do it. Now, that also means you're over punishing because now you're telling your SROs to handle it. I have yet to have a principal sign a juvenile complaint. It's the SROs that are doing it. That way the school can say, it wasn't me, it was the one-armed man, you know, and it absolves them of any kind of accountability, even though this law, if you look at it, it will say that the principal, okay? Now, it looks optional in the beginning. It looks optional. And it's not, though, that the principal require a public school principal to immediately notify law enforcement if the conduct of the student warrants the charge of making a terrorist threat in the first or second degree. Now, who makes that decision? Does the principal? Because that's the other thing. Why do we need to make this change? Because we already have some few old laws on the books in Alabama to where the principal doesn't have autonomy. The principal can't be the righteous judge anymore. Under penalty of law, he can be criminally charged if he does not report any possible juvenile criminal act to the SRO. Then the SRO will make a determination of whether or not it warrants an additional charge. So we really set our principals up to be the bad guys all the way around. They can't be righteous judges. Some are. Some sit there and they fly in the face of all this and say, I'm not going to sit there and do this nonsense. At the same time, this is nothing but a convoluted restatement of something that the principals are already required to do. So why do we need an additional change? And then later on in this same proposed legislation change, it basically says that they don't have the option. But that's not how it's written in the beginning. It's really confusing. But I believe at the end of the day, this wasn't the DAs. I think that this is a super. This is the education system by itself wanting to solve a problem. And this is the easiest way to do it, instead of going to the state and saying, we need day programs. We need to create regions. We need a solution for this, because they don't want to spend the money. See, by charging all these kids, who gets to pay for it? Well, the families do forever, up to $10,000 if they're convicted or adjudicated. But like I said, 99.99% of my cases are adjudicated.
Yeah.
They don't have the clarifier in there that if the DA offers a lower charge of harassment, it doesn't say that. It just says if the whole thing's been adjudicated. At that point, that means it's an automatic year suspension. Screw special education law, because yes, the school system still has the requirement, even if a child is expelled or long-term suspended, the school system still has a legal duty under state and federal law to provide the child special education services, not general education services. There's a difference between the two. And so, yes, they're still receiving their right to special education services, but how are schools delivering it since COVID? Not in person. They're doing it virtually. And how many kids are virtual students? They're not.
Yeah.
So there's this appearance as though these kids are getting services. There's an appearance that they're still having to be served. But what ends up happening is if a court order from a judge says this kid is suspended for a year because of this bill and the language change, then every IEP team in this state is going to be hamstrung. They can't do a thing about it. They can't move along that least restrictive environment continuum. They can't, say, hey, this it was a manifestation of a child's disability, which there's a requirement there that they have to have a manifestation determination meeting. Hey, this kid, this isn't what you guys thought it was. It wasn't a terrorist threat. It was, it's part of his disability. This is what we're going to do to help him. That it doesn't matter, because if a judge says, sorry, this bill says it's a year suspension, well, then the IEP team is hamstrung and have to work within the confines of this new expanded law. Thus, the schools get what they want, and that's removing these kids.
Yeah. So we've already got one of these bills that have passed through. I mean, what do you say for families, that find themselves in a situation? Because we know that they are. Like, that's why this exists, right?
Well, and a lot of families don't think it's going to happen to them. We just picked up a client that this did happen to his son. And the reason he knows about us is he's an SRO in a neighboring school system with an autistic son. And yeah, he got railroaded last week. And so we're having to represent him. And he knew us because of our interactions in that school. And that's the first thing he said is he says, I just never thought it would happen to me. And no parent
Everyone
does.
says that.
Nobody does. And I know that there's public out there, and I'm with you. I can tell you right now, I wouldn't do that with my own daughter. I would not put her in an environment where I know that she is unhappy and she is unsafe. And that includes to other students. And so I am not one of these attorneys that come in there and go, well, Johnny just needs to be in that general education. I won't represent you. I'm sorry. If it's not an appropriate environment for your child, then it's not an appropriate environment. I want to make sure that the steps were taken, though, and as long as the steps were taken, we can solve the problem in another environment, maybe a hybrid environment. We can think through these problems. But a lot of the problem is that these schools, they take this stuff too far. They leave kids in environments too long that end up interfering with the education of the other students, the ability of the teacher to teach, and also the stigma and the damage done to the child that's having the meltdown and the behaviors. It impacts everybody. So I understand that I absolutely understand we've got a problem in this state. This isn't the answer though.
No.
Because with these meltdowns, these kids will make what I call excited utterances. They'll say things. Now, why is that? They're naive, they're immature, and it's part of their disability in a lot of cases because they understand, how do I get out of this math class? I just didn't think about it when I was a kid, or I hated math. Maybe I would have done it. But these kids are not, and people go, well, why would he threaten to kill people or blow up the school? Well, because you ushered him out of the class the minute he said it. He didn't have to do math. He got to go over here to this fun place, and you guys let him, scribble on paper and color, Well, that was really, it was really dumb, but he's 10 and he's got severe ADHD. He's not regulated like we as adults. He doesn't have those expectations. We have to teach consequences and expectations within limitations and within reason. And this is where our schools and the state, through this bill as well, have gone completely out into left field to where we're not balancing, like I said, the righteous judge, where we're not being that for our kids. And, this is extremely damaging and will have long-term damaging consequences on the kids impacted. And I am just one of those believers as a constitutionalist and as a more libertarian-minded individual that, by the way, when I lived in Alabama, I was part of a certain county's Republican committee. Okay. I was. And, my wife and I are both very political, but that was back in the day. I'm not, I just am one of these to where people want to take pot shots and go, well, James is some leftist, whatever. Just say what you will about me. I don't care.
It's okay, James. I get that all the time.
Well,
it depends on the day for me. One day I'm too Republican, one day I'm not Republican enough.
Well,
but yeah.
And this is the thing. Everybody wants to box us into these labels instead of going, you know what, maybe it's just common sense. So maybe I don't want to live in a police state. Maybe I'm recognizing that the institution's the problem. Kids haven't changed. The institution's changed.
And a lot of these things they're nonpartisan issues. We're talking about children here and basic rights for education. It should be nonpartisan.
And the worst offenders, quite frankly, the worst offenders I have to deal with in the state with regards to their heavy-handed, they're blue cities. Okay. In New Mexico, my worst offender is probably the gem of left politics in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it's one of the worst offenders. And you would think that they would be very empathetic and very sympathetic toward, special education or special needs. And it's one of my worst, historically one of the worst offenders since I opened my office there. So, in Alabama, I have to go into blue cities, red counties, purple suburbs. I see it all, and I see it up close, and I see it dirty, and I see it nasty. And I understand the politics of it because I would be a very bad attorney in this area that is administrative in nature. It's administrative in nature. It's an appendage off of the federal court system. And so because of that, and there's no damages, there's no money damages in what I do. It's about corrective action. So I'm almost like an education consultant to where I'm looking at this stuff and I'm going, hey, parents, we can do better here. We can advocate better here. School system, this is where you messed up. We need more training. We need more resources over here. That's what I do. And so because that's what I do, and there are no money damages to any of this stuff, I am a big believer in our public education system. But I'm telling you, the people killing our public education system in Alabama is the legislature and the school systems. They're the ones killing public education. And then at the same time, the legislature just passed the Choose Act. Okay, so get your kid out of public school before this happens to them. Get them out. Take that money, create micro schools, homeschool, create homeschool athletic associations, because my 3 boys were homeschooled. My daughter always went to public school. We decided to homeschool our children, our boys, because I did not want what I do for a living to potentially ripple over and impact them negatively. But my youngest, we're in a very strong homeschool athletic association co-op to where we play tackle football against public schools.
Wow.
There is absolutely nothing that my son is not getting with regards to socialization, athletics, and I'm talking about playing public schools. He gets to choose his courses like a college course preference. And all of my boys, my youngest has yet to take the SAT, but the other 2, no, that they scored off the charts. My 23-year-old's at a major university. So this whole thing to where, whatever the old stigma was about that is done. And I've been trying to warn public schools for years that if you don't change the market will control this narrative. It will. And the legislature, by doing this bill, they're either naive or they're incredibly dumb. If they cannot see 3 or 4 steps down the road. And I find it interesting that the 2 guys that sponsored it are 2 of the newer representatives and senators that maybe some of the other guys didn't want to walk into that little minefield and let the new guys do it.
Yeah.
That's not the first time that the big boys, did something to the new guys. If you want to call it
an initiation.
Well, yeah, but what do they call it in
hazing?
In sororities? Hazing. It's a form of hazing to where, let's say Lomax at the end of the day goes, I can't believe I got suckered into this. Well, congratulations. You decided to go into politics, and this is the game. And you need to check who's behind this stuff. Who is because it's never the person that's approaching you with it. Who's the people behind the people behind the people? And it was
we
really
know all too well.
Yeah. And that's what I'm still trying to figure out. So if anybody out there watching this has a legislator that, a senator or I would press them, ask them, who is the people behind this really? Who is it? Because the DAs would have no motivation to do this because they don't really see what's going on inside the schools.
That was going to be my last question to you.
I have some thoughts. About who's behind it, but yeah.
That was going to be my last question since we've come up here on the hour. And I'll just ask you again so we can have a viral worthy clip here maybe. What can people do, in your opinion, to help stop these bills?
Oh, they have to call their senators, especially in Alabama right now, because that's where we stop it. In the House, it's already passed. Now, I think I don't even know if it was unanimous. It might have been unanimous. I haven't looked that up. I heard that it passed with flying colors. Because if you name something nice, and it looks like it's a safety bill, then everybody can chalk it up as, oh, look what I did. I voted on a nice bill.
Without even understanding the implications.
I mean, look, we've already heard that. I mean, all of us suffer from a malaise that follow politics. Remember what Pelosi said years ago. You have to pass it to read it. Well, we'll let you read the bill after you pass it. Well, I feel like that's what's going on now, that, as long as there's a summary, because we're so lazy intellectually now, that AI has now created this laziness. My 17-year-old was complaining about that. When you Google something, now you just get an AI summary. You don't even have to go and search. But how do we know the AI summary is correct? And you don't. But this is where we're not taking the necessary second, third, fourth step that we used to be required to take in order to understand the damage of the flood downstream. Who's downstream of all this? And that's what Lomax and Woods never bothered to ask when they decided they wanted to sponsor this stuff. So that's where we stop it, especially state senators. This is where we need to say, not this legislative session, not this. We need to understand why this is such an emergency. Who is behind it? If we really believe it needs to be changed, we can do that next session. We can sit there and tweak the language. But as it's currently written, guys, they changed the definition of credible threat to be extremely vague and ambiguous to catch just anybody for saying anything, as long as that other individual reasonably perceived, not proven, reasonably perceived that you had the intent and you had the means to harm them or carry out. And it's not only against yourself, it could be against property. And I mean, and then they also changed the wording to where I think a pencil could be defined as a weapon, a pencil. And I already represent kids that, he threw a pencil at me. It almost stuck me in the head. I'm like, really? But that's what I am representing kids. Should they
like a pencil was used as a weapon against my son, but I cannot imagine being able to sleep at night knowing that like criminal charges were pressed against that child that threw the pencil or that stabbed him with the pencil. I mean, makes no sense to me.
One of the craziest weapons. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
And I, but this is a thing under the federal statute, because we have something called the HONIG exception, HONIG, to where you can bypass the special education and disability safeguards for these students under 3 things. And that's weapon. Well, that's a gun or a knife that's over 1.5 inches. Okay. Nothing else. Second is drugs. Okay. That doesn't mean your own prescription drugs, even though I've had schools go after kids that have forgotten to wear the same jeans and they just had their Adderall in their pocket because they were at their grandma's and forgot to take it. Well, now they're trafficking at school because somebody saw it in their pants. And then the third one is serious bodily injury. But serious bodily injury has to meet the federal definition. And that is an incredibly high standard for serious bodily injury. And a lot of schools are already misapplying that as an excuse to remove children, claiming that, this kid struck me. Okay, I get it. The kid has severe or moderate autism. That's not an excuse. I am not excusing behaviors, especially in general education or even in self-contained special education settings. At the same time, do we have enough of these settings? No, we do not have enough. And whose responsibility is that? That is the state of Alabama. It's our legislature. They're not doing their job in this capacity. So criminalizing these kids to either keep them home, where now you're impacting families that require a dual income because maybe you're, I don't know if anybody's read the room with regards to how our economy works, but a lot of these families cannot afford to leave their children home by themselves. And so this is also causing economic harm, but yet the schools are cashing the checks because as long as they can get that money after showing them there and enrolled for the first week or so, they get to cash that check and then they can terrorist threat them out of there.
Right.
So, call your senator. We need to stop. I don't think that there's anything redeemable about it. There's just not.
I don't think
not
so
in
either.
its current form.
Reading over it, I mean, one of the craziest things, this is what I was going to say a second ago when we were talking about weapons. It's talking about, let me find it here again, something about radiation that can emit, a weapon that can emit radiation or something. I'm like, who?
Well, that's your cell phone.
Yeah, a weapon that is designed to release radiation or radioactivity at a level dangerous to human life. What were we thinking about that we decided we were going to add that in there? It just seems like we just went on Chat GPT and we said, hey, think about everything that could harm somebody and let's add it in this bill is what it sounds like to me. It's crazy.
But the most troubling aspect is that you don't even have to be found guilty. It just says to specifically provide that being charged with either crime is a reason for which a student shall immediately be suspended for a minimum of 1 year, and then to provide further for the conditions of readmittance, meaning that the state of Alabama, the legislature is not determining. They're not determining how the child readmits into the school. That's the Board of Education. So they get the primacy. The Board of Education, through this bill change, they get to determine what the conditions are. And so remember that kid I told you about that they put him on a virtual platform for a year? In order for him to come back, and what he didn't even do anything. They sent him to the alternative school where he was bullied relentlessly, and he defended himself 4 times in fights that he didn't start. Now, they have a 3 strikes policy at their alternative school. So after the 4th fight, expulsion. But instead of expelling him, they put him on long-term suspension for a year in the virtual platform. But in order for him to come back, he had to do 45 days at the alternative school. So 1 calendar year of school virtual, and then for him to come back, he had to do 45 days, which is basically the first 9 weeks in the alternative school before he could even step foot in his general education setting. For what? Because he was on the receiving end of some butt kicking? I mean, it just...
This is so wrong.
Yeah.
There's no common sense applied. And so, but we don't have enough attorneys like myself. And unfortunately with this stuff, parents, if a school is wrong and the juvenile court does this, they can't recover their attorney fees. So it is purely just out of pocket that in order to defend their child in juvenile court, there are mechanisms under the federal and state disability rights to where the school system, if they're wrong in what they did, yes, they have to pay my attorney fees, which makes me very accessible to the poorest of families, which levels the playing field. And really, schools change if everybody's represented, not just their high-income families.
Right.
So representing the lowest possible, what the schools say, these are the ones that they can just take advantage of that are on the roller mill of mental health, DHR. Like I said, the families that are struggling. I proudly represent that segment of our population because that's where real change happens, unfortunately, because those are the ones that the school systems in rural and small cities that these are the nobodies in the communities, the ones without voices. These schools can't run all over them.
Right.
And like I said, what we talked about earlier is that the ones that say this would never happen to me, that's our educated middle and upper class. That's
Mhm.
people in my demographic that were like, oh, that would never happen to me. Yeah, you're right, because you're somebody in your community. You're right.
Mhm.
But I don't work in this field to protect people in my demographic. What kind of constitutional attorney would I be if I sit there and I was picking and choosing who I wanted to represent? And because that's not what our laws are there for. Our
That's right.
laws are there to protect the most vulnerable within our population, and people are innocent until proven guilty. Not according to this bill. These kids are automatically suspended for a year.
Mhm.
All they have to do is be charged. The only mitigation comes later on in the bill, to where if they're adjudicated or found guilty, then the time might be reduced. But the readmittance process depends on the Board of Education, and they're allowed to create that internally as to how do we readmit them. So as I told you, if 99.99% of these cases are adjudicated through deals with the DA with a lower charge, or let's say an informal adjustment, meaning if the kid does what they're asked for 6 months, the charge just sort of goes away, which is what most of us do, is these informal adjustments. But then also there's added in there that if the kid gets charged twice in a calendar year, man, it changes to a felony D? I mean, this is, like I said, innocent until proven guilty is non-existent in this, but it's non-existent in our current statute. So why we're
Mhm.
changing it to really throw gasoline on the fact that these kids are guilty before ever given a chance to prove their innocence is absolutely beyond me in a civil free society. And Alabama prides itself, we dare defend our rights, do we? And this legislature, especially dominated by the Republican Party, I am sorely disappointed. And
Mhm.
especially in some of these Lomax, we're Facebook friends. I knew who he was and followed him coming out of university. Um, he, I expect more from him. I
Yeah.
don't know Woods enough yet. Same thing.
I expect
Barely
more
knew
from all
West.
of them.
Yeah.
I,
Absolutely.
I, I've walked. Sorry. Some of them are
Yeah.
not redeemable human beings. The ones that have been there a long time. They're
I
just
think
not.
I'm looking at most of them right now, like none of them are really worth redemption at this point. Well, James, I really appreciated this conversation. I actually, like, of all the bills and education bills and, rights for all, these were two that I actually had not followed closely. And I'm just added to the bucket of things that piss me off in the state right now. But thank you so much for that insight. And we would love to have you back. I mean, me and Neeli, we first linked up with issues between, in the school system. Obviously, I'm in Baldwin County. She's at the beach school system. And our path just kept intersecting. That's how we got here today. You are our first, I guess, education, rights
Interviewee.
guest.
Yeah.
Yes, that we've had on. And this is really how me and Neeli got started together. So thank you so much for everything. And thank you for all that you do for the families that you represent.
Yeah. Thank
Well,
you.
and I appreciate this opportunity. What a great platform. And, I appreciate you guys raising your voice in this area. It's that important. And so
It's
I
very
greatly
important.
appreciate that. But any time that I'll fit that into my schedule, this
Thank
is a very
you.
important discussion to have, especially this time of year when
Yes.
these magic bills are popping up out of nowhere. And it takes, it takes an informed populace. And the nice thing is that we have a very well organized special needs population in Alabama that if they're aware and that they know, they will disseminate this information and they will show up and they will make calls.
Yes.
So
Period.
Yes.
they absolutely will. But like I said, the other one that we didn't have an opportunity to talk about with regards to mental health and wanting to take over the licensing board, for example, it's one of the functions of the licensing board for the behavior analysts that do ABA therapy and other things. We didn't have an
Well-
opportunity to talk about that, but
No, but we will definitely get you back on to talk about that. Really, anything else you want to talk to? disability is very close to my heart, and Whitney also. So please consider this an open invitation. If there's anything that we're not aware of and you want to reach out and talk to us about it, we'll be happy to have you back on.
Send us an email. We will gather the troops together. If
Yeah.
there's a bill that needs to be fought against, seriously.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Make It Make Sense, Alabama is brought to you by Murder Creek Media. If you've never heard of us and want to check out some of our other projects, including our investigative true crime series, visit murdercreekmedia.com to learn more. Thanks for listening, and we'll see y'all soon.